Welcome to my channel. What if the greatest enemy standing between you and your dream was not a difficult exam, not a lack of talent, not your circumstances, and not even the people who doubted you, but a quiet voice living inside your own mind? A voice that appears every time you are about to take a chance and whispers, "No, you can't do this." Imagine hearing that voice so many times that you eventually stop questioning it. Imagine having the ability to succeed, the preparation to succeed, and the opportunity to succeed, yet walking away because your own mind convinces you that failure is waiting for you. This was the hidden battle Daniel had been fighting for years, and the most frightening part was that nobody around him knew. From the outside, Daniel looked like the kind of student every teacher wanted in class. He was intelligent, curious, hardworking, and capable of understanding difficult subjects faster than many of his classmates. His notebooks were always organized, his assignments were usually complete, and when teachers asked questions, he often knew the answers before anyone else. People looked at him and assumed he was confident. They believed his future was already bright. But Daniel knew a truth that nobody else could see. The moment an opportunity appeared, something inside his mind changed. Before every important exam, before every presentation, before every conversation, and before every chance to prove himself, a familiar voice arrived. "No, you can't do this." At first, Daniel thought it was simply nervousness. Everyone gets nervous, he told himself. But over time, the voice became stronger. When he prepared for an exam, it whispered, "What if you forget everything?" When he opened his books, it said, "You are probably not prepared enough." When he thought about speaking English, it warned, "You will make mistakes and everyone will laugh." When someone offered him an opportunity, the voice immediately found a reason to reject it. Daniel had a dream. He wanted to speak English confidently, communicate without fear, perform well in his studies, and eventually build a successful career. He imagined himself standing in a room full of people, speaking clearly while everyone listened. He imagined receiving opportunities that could change his future. He imagined becoming the person he knew he could be. But every time he moved toward that future, the same voice pulled him backward. "Not you. Someone else can do it. You are not ready." Daniel listened. One morning, an important examination was approaching. Daniel had prepared for weeks. He had studied the lessons, reviewed his notes, practiced difficult questions, and even created a schedule for revision. Deep inside, he knew he was ready. Yet the night before the exam, his mind began creating a completely different story. What if the questions are too difficult? What if your mind goes blank? What if everyone performs better than you? Daniel tried to ignore the thoughts, but they became louder. He studied late into the night, not because he needed more preparation, but because he was afraid to trust the preparation he already had. The next morning, he entered the examination hall with a heavy mind. When the paper was placed in front of him, something happened that he had feared. His heart began beating faster. His hands became cold. He looked at the first question, and suddenly the answer he had known the previous evening seemed to disappear. His mind went blank. Daniel stared at the paper, silently repeating the words he had heard so many times before. "You can't do this." He tried to fight the thought, but panic had already taken control. He eventually completed the exam, but he knew he had not performed at his true ability. When the result arrived, it was lower than expected. Daniel looked at the score for a long time, then the voice returned. "See? I told you. Maybe you are not as intelligent as everyone thinks." That sentence hurt more than the result itself. For the first time, Daniel began to question his own intelligence. Maybe his teachers had been wrong. Maybe his classmates were better. Maybe his dreams were too big. Then, a few days later, an English-speaking competition was announced at college. The winner would receive recognition and a chance to represent the college at a larger event. Daniel immediately felt excitement, but the excitement lasted only a few seconds. The voice appeared again. "Don't embarrass yourself." Daniel imagined standing on stage, forgetting words, making grammar mistakes, and hearing people laugh. So when his teacher asked if he wanted to participate, Daniel lowered his eyes and quietly said no. Another opportunity disappeared. Later, Daniel watched his classmate walk onto the stage and deliver a confident English speech. The audience applauded. Daniel sat silently, feeling something painful inside. He knew he could have tried. He knew he had the knowledge, but he had allowed fear to make the decision for him. That evening, while walking home, Daniel finally asked himself a question he could no longer escape. How many opportunities will I lose before I realize that the voice inside my head is not always telling me the truth? For the first time, he wondered whether the real problem was not his intelligence, his English, or his ability. Perhaps the real problem was that he had trusted every negative thought as if it were a fact. And that realization was about to change everything. The question followed Daniel all the way home. How many opportunities will I lose before I realize that the voice inside my head is not always telling me the truth? That night, he sat alone at his desk and opened the notebook where he had written his goals months earlier. The pages were filled with plans, dreams, and promises to himself. He wanted to improve his English. He wanted to perform better in college. He wanted to become confident. He wanted to build a successful future. But as he looked at those words, something suddenly became painfully clear. His dreams had not changed, but his actions had. He had been waiting for confidence before taking action, waiting for certainty before trying, and waiting for his fear to disappear before moving forward. Then he asked himself another difficult question. If I keep living like this, where will I be 5 years from now? The thought frightened him more than any exam ever had. Daniel realized that the future he feared was not created by one huge failure. It was created by hundreds of small decisions to stay silent, stay comfortable, and obey the voice that always said no. The next morning, Daniel went to college carrying a different kind of curiosity. He wanted to understand his mind. During a quiet conversation with one of his teachers, Daniel finally explained what he had been experiencing. He told him about the negative voice, the fear before opportunities, the anxiety during exams, and the constant feeling that he would fail even when he was prepared. His teacher listened carefully and then asked a question Daniel had never considered before. Do you control your thoughts, or do your thoughts control you? Daniel remained silent. The question seemed simple, but it reached deeper than anything else. He had always assumed that if a thought appeared in his mind, it must be important. If his mind said he would fail, he believed it. If his mind said people would laugh, he believed it. If his mind said he was not ready, he obeyed it. His teacher then gave him a strange challenge. For the next 7 days, spend only 5 minutes each morning sitting quietly. Close your eyes, breathe naturally, and watch your thoughts. Do not fight them. Do not argue with them. Just observe them. Daniel was unsure. Meditation sounded simple, but he had never imagined that sitting quietly could help him solve the problems inside his mind. Still, he agreed to try. The next morning, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. For approximately 3 seconds, everything seemed peaceful. Then his mind exploded. Did you finish your assignment? What if you fail the next exam? Why are you wasting your time? You should check your phone. You are not good at meditation either. Daniel opened his eyes immediately. He felt frustrated. Somehow, 5 minutes had felt like an entire hour. He thought, I can't even meditate. Maybe my teacher was wrong about me. Then he remembered the instruction, do not fight the thoughts, observe them. So, he closed his eyes again. A thought appeared, you can't do this. Daniel almost accepted it automatically. But then something different happened. Instead of believing the thought, he asked himself, is this a fact, or is it only a thought? The question created a tiny space inside his mind. Daniel suddenly understood something powerful. The voice had been speaking for years, but he had never questioned it. He had treated every negative thought like a prediction from the future. Yet the voice had been wrong before. It had told him he would fail exams, but he had passed many of them. It had told him people would laugh if he spoke English, but not everyone had laughed. It had told him he was incapable, even though his teachers repeatedly recognized his intelligence. Daniel began to see the difference between a thought and reality. A thought could feel real without actually being true. Fear could sound convincing without being correct. Doubt could appear powerful without having authority. This discovery did not immediately remove his negative voice, but it changed Daniel's relationship with it. Instead of saying, I am going to fail, he began saying, I am having a thought that I might fail. Instead of saying, I cannot speak English, he said, my mind is telling me that I cannot speak English. The difference was small, but it gave him power. Daniel continued his 5-minute practice every morning. Some days were peaceful, other days were difficult. His mind constantly tested him. This is useless. You have better things to do. You are wasting 5 minutes. But Daniel no longer needed to fight the voice. He simply noticed it. There is that thought again. Then he returned to his breathing. Slowly, something inside him began to change. He realized that meditation was not about destroying negative thoughts. It was about becoming aware of them without allowing them to control every decision. One morning, Daniel woke up and immediately reached for his phone. His fingers were already moving toward it when he remembered his new habit. For a moment, the voice said, just check your messages first. Daniel paused. He placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly. 5 minutes later, he opened his eyes. Nothing dramatic had happened. The world had not changed. But Daniel had won a small battle. For the first time, he had noticed an urge, observed it, and chosen differently. That tiny victory gave him confidence. A few days later, the voice returned even louder. You are wasting your time with this meditation. Stop. Daniel smiled slightly. He recognized the voice now. He did not need to obey it. He simply breathed and thought, I hear you, but I don't have to obey you. And for the first time in his life, Daniel began to understand that perhaps freedom did not mean making the voice disappear. Perhaps freedom meant hearing the voice and still choosing his own direction. A few weeks passed, and Daniel's relationship with his mind slowly began to change. The negative voice was still there, but it no longer felt like an unstoppable force. Before, whenever the voice said, you will fail, Daniel immediately believed it. Now, he could pause and ask, is this actually true? That pause became his new source of strength. One afternoon, Daniel was sitting in class when his teacher asked a simple question in English. Daniel knew the answer immediately. He had understood the lesson perfectly, and there was no reason he could not respond. But the familiar voice appeared instantly. Stay quiet. Someone else will answer. What if your English is wrong? Daniel felt his heart beating faster. His first instinct was to look down at his notebook, just as he had done many times before. But then he remembered his 5 minutes of meditation that morning. He remembered the difference between a thought and a fact. He took a slow breath and noticed the fear instead of becoming the fear. Then, something unexpected happened. Daniel slowly raised his hand. The teacher looked at him and smiled. Yes, Daniel? Daniel stood and began answering. His voice was not perfectly confident. His grammar was not perfect either. Halfway through his answer, he made a small mistake. A few students laughed quietly. The old Daniel would have immediately felt destroyed. He would have spent the entire day replaying the moment in his mind, telling himself that he should never speak English again. But this time, Daniel paused. The negative voice appeared. I told you so. You embarrassed yourself. Never do that again. Daniel listened to it, but he did not obey. He finished his answer, sat down, and took a breath. His heart was still beating quickly, but something inside him felt different. He had made a mistake, and the world had not ended. The classroom was still there. His teacher was still there. His future was still there. Later that evening, Daniel sat quietly and thought about what had happened. He realized that the real victory was not that he had answered perfectly. The victory was that he had acted while feeling afraid. For years, he had believed confidence had to come first and action would come afterward. Now, he understood the truth. Sometimes action comes first and confidence follows. A mistake was not proof that he was incapable. It was proof that he was practicing. That night, Daniel wrote one sentence in his notebook. I made a mistake, that's all. He read it several times. Those 4 words felt strangely powerful. He did not need to turn one mistake into a story about his entire future. He did not need to decide that one embarrassing moment meant he would never succeed. He could simply accept what happened, learn from it, and continue. From that day forward, Daniel started practicing English every day. He did not set a goal of becoming perfect. Instead, he created a smaller goal. He would speak even when his mind told him to stay silent. Every morning, after 5 minutes of meditation, he practiced speaking aloud. Sometimes he described his room. Sometimes he talked about his studies. Sometimes he read a paragraph and repeated it. The words were not always perfect, but he continued. Slowly, the 5 minutes of meditation began influencing the rest of his day. When he noticed fear, he paused. When he noticed doubt, he questioned it. When he felt the urge to quit, he gave himself time before making a decision. Daniel was learning that the mind could produce thousands of thoughts, but he did not have to turn every thought into an action. Yet, just when Daniel believed he was finally becoming stronger, life tested him again. One afternoon, his professor entered the classroom with an announcement. The college was preparing a major English presentation event. Hundreds of students were expected to attend, and selected students would have the opportunity to present on stage. Daniel listened carefully. Then the professor said his name. Daniel, I want you to consider presenting. For a moment, the entire room seemed to disappear. This was the opportunity he had once dreamed about. It was also the exact situation he feared most. Speaking English in front of hundreds of people, standing under bright lights, knowing that every mistake could be heard, his mind immediately reacted. No, this is too big for you. Daniel felt the familiar pressure returning. His heart began beating faster. The teacher continued explaining the event, but Daniel could barely listen. Inside his mind, the negative voice became louder. You are not ready. You will forget everything. People will laugh. You already made mistakes in front of your class. Imagine what will happen in front of hundreds. Daniel looked around the room. He knew he could simply say no. Nobody would force him. He could return to his comfortable routine and avoid the fear. The opportunity would disappear, and life would continue. But something inside Daniel had changed. Months earlier, he would have rejected the opportunity without hesitation. Now, he recognized the voice. He knew exactly what it was doing. It was trying to protect him from embarrassment, but in protecting him from discomfort, it was also protecting him from growth. Daniel took a deep breath. The voice said, "Say no." Daniel looked at his teacher and answered, "Yes, I will do it." The moment the words left his mouth, fear rushed through his entire body. He had said yes, and now there was no easy way to hide. The voice inside his head became furious. "Why did you do that? You are going to regret it." Daniel almost changed his mind, but then he remembered the lesson he had learned through meditation. A thought was not an order. Fear was not a command. Anxiety was not a prediction. He had made a decision, and now he would give himself the chance to discover what was possible. The days that followed were difficult. Daniel prepared his presentation carefully. He practiced his English. He recorded his voice. He watched himself speaking in the mirror. He made mistakes, corrected them, and practiced again. But every night, when he imagined the stage, his mind created frightening pictures. He saw himself forgetting his words. He imagined silence filling the hall. He imagined hundreds of people staring at him. Sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night with his heart racing. What have I done? He wondered. The night before the presentation, Daniel sat at his desk, unable to sleep. His presentation was ready. His notes were complete. He had practiced countless times. Yet, the fear remained. Then Daniel understood something important. He was not actually afraid of the presentation itself. He was afraid of a future that existed only inside his imagination. His mind had created a disaster that had not happened, and Daniel was suffering as if it were already real. He closed his eyes and began his 5-minute meditation. Thoughts appeared immediately. You will fail. He observed it. What if everyone laughs? He observed it. You are not ready. He observed it. Then he took a slow breath and whispered, Maybe I am afraid, but fear does not get to make my decision. For 5 minutes, Daniel sat with his fear. He did not fight it. He did not run from it. He simply allowed it to exist without obeying it. When the 5 minutes ended, Daniel opened his eyes. He was still nervous. He was still afraid. But he was no longer confused. He finally understood the battle he had been fighting all along. The battle was not against the world. It was not against his classmates. It was not even against failure. The real battle was against the voice that had convinced him he needed to feel fearless before he could act. And tomorrow, Daniel would discover whether he had truly learned to live by his own decisions. The next morning arrived faster than Daniel wanted. He woke before his alarm, and for a few seconds he stared at the ceiling, hoping that somehow the presentation had been canceled. Then, reality returned. Today was the day. His stomach felt tight, and his mind immediately began producing reasons to escape. You can still tell the professor you are sick. You can say you are not prepared. You can step away before anyone notices. Daniel sat up slowly. The voice sounded convincing because it had always sounded convincing. But now Daniel knew something it had never wanted him to discover. A thought could sound powerful without being true. He got out of bed, washed his face, and sat quietly for 5 minutes. He focused on his breathing. His mind wandered again and again, but he kept returning. When the 5 minutes ended, he did not feel magically fearless. Instead, he felt something more valuable. He felt ready to make his own decision. At college, the atmosphere was different. Students were moving toward the auditorium, talking excitedly about the presentations. Daniel could hear voices everywhere. He looked at the large stage and immediately felt his old fear return. "Turn around," the negative voice whispered. "You are not ready. You are going to fail." Daniel stopped near the entrance. His hands became cold. For one dangerous moment, he considered leaving. Then he remembered all the times he had listened to that voice. He remembered the opportunities he had rejected, the conversations he had avoided, the exams where fear had made his mind blank, and the dreams he had postponed. He realized that every time he obeyed the voice, his world became smaller. Every time he obeyed fear, another door closed. Daniel took a deep breath. "Maybe I'm not ready," he whispered, "but I'm going anyway." Then he walked inside. The auditorium was larger than he had imagined. Hundreds of students were sitting in front of the stage. Daniel could feel his heartbeat in his chest. His name was announced, and for a second, everything became silent in his mind. He walked toward the microphone. Each step felt heavier than the last. The negative voice was still speaking. "This is your last chance to turn back." Daniel reached the stage. His hands were shaking. He adjusted the microphone and looked at the audience. For a moment, he forgot the opening sentence. His mind went blank. The old Daniel would have panicked. He would have rushed away from the stage, believing that the voice had been right all along. But this time, Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second and breathed. He remembered the 5-minute practice. Noticed the thought, "Do not fight it. Do not obey it. Return to the present." He opened his eyes and looked at the first row. Then he said the first sentence. His voice was quiet. He continued. The second sentence came more easily, then the third. Slowly, the words began to flow. Daniel made a pronunciation mistake. A few people noticed. His mind immediately shouted, "See? You are failing." But Daniel continued. He made another small grammar mistake. This time, he smiled and corrected himself. Something unexpected happened. The audience did not laugh. They simply waited for him to continue. Daniel began to understand that the disaster his mind had predicted was not happening. The fear was real, but the danger was imaginary. His heart was beating fast, but he was safe. His hands were shaking, but he could still speak. He was nervous, but he was still standing. And then something inside him became calm, not because the fear disappeared, but because Daniel stopped treating fear as a reason to stop. He finished his presentation. When he said the final sentence, there was a moment of silence. Then the audience applauded. Daniel stood there, almost unable to believe it. The presentation had not been perfect. He had made mistakes. His pronunciation had not been flawless. His confidence had not been complete. But he had finished. He had done something the voice inside his head had told him was impossible. As Daniel walked off the stage, his professor congratulated him. "You did well," he said, "not because everything was perfect, but because you stayed with it." Those words remained in Daniel's mind. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was the decision to continue while fear was present. Later that afternoon, something even more unexpected happened. Daniel was approached by one of the organizers. The presentation had been noticed by a visiting educational organization that was looking for students who could participate in an international English communication program. Daniel was invited to apply. The opportunity was much bigger than the presentation. It could give him access to new experiences, advanced training, and connections that could influence his future career. But there was a problem. The application required another interview in English. The old voice returned immediately. "No, you cannot do this. The presentation was luck. This is different. You will fail the interview." Daniel stood quietly, holding the application form. He could feel the familiar fear trying to take control. For a moment, he almost laughed. The voice had returned exactly when another opportunity appeared. Then Daniel realized something profound. The voice had not disappeared because he had meditated. It had not been destroyed by his success. It was still there. Maybe it would always be there. But Daniel was different. He no longer needed the voice to disappear before he moved forward. He no longer needed permission from his fear. He looked at the application form and remembered the student he used to be. That student had once believed every negative thought. That student had rejected opportunities before even trying. That student had thought confidence was something other people were born with. But the person standing there now understood the truth. Confidence was not a gift. It was built through action. Daniel took the form and signed his name. He applied. The interview was difficult. He made mistakes. There were moments when he struggled to find the right words, but he stayed. He answered every question he could. He listened carefully. He breathed when he felt nervous. And when the interview ended, Daniel walked outside knowing that he had already won something more important than acceptance. He had won control over his choices. A few weeks later, Daniel received the message. He had been accepted. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he smiled. The opportunity that had once seemed impossible was now real. His journey did not suddenly become perfect after that. There were still difficult exams. There were still moments of self-doubt. There were still days when the negative voice became loud. Sometimes Daniel failed. Sometimes he felt overwhelmed. Sometimes he wanted to quit. But now, he had a new relationship with his mind. Whenever the voice said, "No, you can't," Daniel would pause. He would breathe. He would observe the thought. Then he would ask himself, is this a fact or is this fear? Sometimes the answer was fear. Sometimes the answer was uncertainty. And sometimes there really was a risk of failure. But Daniel had learned something even more powerful. He did not need certainty to take action. He did not need a guarantee of success. He only needed the courage to try. Years passed, and Daniel continued practicing meditation. 5 minutes became 10, 10 sometimes became 20. But the number of minutes was never the most important part. The real transformation happened in the space between a thought and a decision. That was where Daniel discovered freedom. He learned that his mind could warn him without controlling him. It could predict failure without deciding his future. It could create fear without becoming the owner of his life. Daniel eventually built a successful career and became confident in English. But whenever people asked him what changed his life, he never talked first about his achievements. He talked about the moment he learned to listen differently. He said, "For years, I believed the voice in my mind was telling me the truth. Whenever it said no, I stopped. Whenever it predicted failure, I believed it. Whenever it told me I wasn't ready, I waited. Then I discovered something that changed everything. My thoughts are not my identity. My fear is not my future. And a negative voice is not the same thing as reality." He would explain that meditation had not magically removed every negative thought. Instead, meditation had taught him to create a small space between the thought and the action. In that space, he could choose. He could hear the voice and still move forward. He could feel fear and still speak. He could doubt himself and still try. He could fail and still continue. And that, Daniel believed, was the greatest freedom anyone could discover. One evening, years after his first presentation, Daniel returned to his old college. He walked through the same hallway where he had once avoided speaking English. He entered the auditorium where he had once stood with shaking hands. Everything looked smaller now. He remembered the boy he had been, the boy who believed that his mind was his enemy. Daniel smiled because he finally understood that his mind had never truly been his enemy. It had simply been untrained, afraid, and trying to protect him from pain. The negative voice had wanted to keep him safe, but safety had become a prison. Meditation had helped him understand that he could appreciate the warning without obeying it. As Daniel stood alone on the empty stage, he remembered the words he had once whispered before walking forward. "Maybe I'm not ready, but I'm going anyway." Those words still carried meaning. Because life would always bring new stages, new opportunities, new fears, new decisions. The voice might return tomorrow, next week, or years from now. It might say, "No, you can't." But Daniel now knew how to answer. He would breathe, he would observe, he would question, and then he would decide for himself. Because the greatest battle of his life had never been against the world. It had been against the voice inside his own mind that constantly tried to define his limits. And the day he learned to observe that voice instead of obeying it, he finally became free. His life changed not because fear disappeared, but because fear lost its authority. The voice could speak, but it could no longer decide. And perhaps that is the lesson Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. You do not have to silence every negative thought to become strong. You do not have to destroy fear to become brave. You do not have to feel completely ready before taking the first step. Sometimes, all you need is 5 quiet minutes to stop, breathe, observe your mind, and remember that you are the one holding the steering wheel. Your thoughts may speak, your fears may warn you, and your doubts may appear, but none of them has the final authority over your future. That authority belongs to you. And the next time the voice inside your mind says, "No, you can't," perhaps you can pause, take a breath, and answer with the courage Daniel finally discovered. Maybe I will fail. Maybe I am not ready. But this time, you don't get to decide. Because sometimes the biggest opportunity of your life is standing directly behind the fear you have spent years avoiding. And sometimes, the person waiting on the other side is not a completely different person. It is simply you, finally brave enough to discover who you are capable of becoming.